Chapter 18 Story English was Eric's last class, the happy period at the end of the day's long sentence. But when Mr. Schofield heard a few boys joking about Mr. Floyd's presentation earlier in the day, he snapped. "You think it's funny?" "Kind of, a little bit," one boy demurred. "It was fun, Mr. Schofield. We even played Jeopardy!" "Jeopardy? Jeopardy? This isn't a game!" Mr. Schofield snapped a piece of chalk in half. It echoed like a gunshot. "Put away that snack, Emily," he demanded. "Everyone, desks cleared. No talking. Eyes on me." "Why are you being such a grouch, Mr. Schofield?" Emily asked. "We haven't done anything." Mr. Schofield turned and strode to the chalkboard. He wrote hastily, the chalk clicking against the board. "We do what we're told." He read the words in a slow, loud voice. "We do what we're told." A few kids grumbled. Mr. Schofield replied sharply, "I am not asking for your cooperation. It's a requirement. Is that understood?" His face reddened. The vein in his forehead flared. It was the first time Eric had seen Mr. Schofield so angry. The class responded with silence. Mr. Schofield wiped the chalk dust off his hand. He launched into a story. In the early 1960s, a Yale professor named Stanley Milgram wondered about the Nazi atrocities in Germany, the Holocaust, the slaughter of 6 million Jews. How was it, Milgram wondered, that these German soldiers could have participated in such unspeakable acts? Someone had to light the ovens. Someone had to stand by and watch it happen. How could these ordinary men and women have allowed this to go on? So Milgram set up an experiment. He recruited 40 volunteers. They were average, everyday people like you or me. Eric's eyes roamed around the room. A few kids had their heads on their desks, but overall, they seemed to be listening, even Mary. The volunteers, Schofield explained, were brought to a laboratory where they met a distinguished-looking scientist in a white lab coat. One by one, each volunteer met a man whom he or she believed to be a middle-aged accountant. After drawing the short straw, the accountant was selected to be the learner in the experiment. The volunteers did not realize, the teacher said, that the accountant was actually a professional actor hired to play a role. The selection process was rigged. A boy called out, "They were punked!" Mr. Schofield nodded. Yes, you could say that. Each volunteer was assured that this was important research. They had critical jobs to perform. The accountant/actor was taken to an adjacent room, where he was hooked up with wires to a large electrical generator. The scientist in the lab coat then asked the man a series of questions. If he replied incorrectly, the volunteer was instructed to flip a switch, delivering an electric shock to the accountant. "Here's where it gets interesting," Mr. Schofield said. "Finally," Mary joked. The class laughed, but quickly grew quiet. They were already curious. The machine had 30 switches, all carefully labeled, ranging from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts of electricity with each shock. Mr. Schofield said, the volunteer was told to increase the voltage. The switches were not actually connected to the electrical generator, but the volunteers did not realize that. As the experiment progressed, the accountant began to moan in pain, then scream, then frantically pound the walls. He begged and pleaded for them to stop the experiment. Hearing this, 14 out of 40 volunteers refused to continue. But 26 others ignored the cries and completed the experiment. They delivered all 30 shocks, all the way to the maximum level. Mr. Schofield looked around the room. I'm sure that some of those 26 people, like you and me, began to have doubts. They sensed it was wrong. They wanted to stop. But each time, the scientist told them in a firm voice that it was essential to continue the experiment. So they followed orders. He pointed at the chalkboard. We do what we are told. Do you understand? The class remained silent, thinking it through, not really getting it. Some watched the clock, began to gather books. The bell was about to sound. Think for yourself, Mr. Schofield urged his students. His eyes seemed to linger on Mary. It doesn't matter what other people do. You have to look into your own heart. What's this got to do with us? A boy asked. Everything, the teacher answered. It's about having the courage to do the right thing. The bell rang. Eric grabbed his books and headed for the door. Mr. Schofield pointed to a photograph of Martin Luther King Jr. that had been tacked to the bulletin board. King called it the appalling silence. Schofield was on his feet now, still teaching even after the bell, still declaiming quotes. In the end, we still remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Strange guy, that Schofield, a little hyper sometimes. But the image stuck in Eric's head like a dart to a wall. A man attached to wires, pounding on walls, pleading, "Stop! Somebody please, make them stop!" It was hard to pretend that the wires were not, in some strange, inexplicable way, connected to him.